Sudo is far from the only game in town. There are like many other marketplaces, like Foundation and Super Rare, and specifically for creator fees, right? I think they're going to provide like better gallery, auction, and like
Yep.
collector support. So, I think that it's like pretty fair to say that, for these low edition collections, right? Like Sudo doesn't even have a good way to like sort by the different art blocks right now because they're all under one contract. So I think, there are going to be better venues to trade, certain types of digital art that, I think appeal more to like both collectors and artists. Whereas, if you look at like, again, the collections that are trading the most on Sudo, right? These are oftentimes, collections that are either like more DeFi native. So the projects themselves have an inclination to set up liquidity pools, or, they're like PFPs where the team has, often raised like 7 figures or more in primary sales. And in that case, I think like if the goal is to make something liquid, collecting like a 3 to 5% tax is like a, less defensible position.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ben, and as usual, I'm the host of today's podcast. Today, we have a very special guest. He is anonymous, but he is also known as Owen, the co-founder of Sudoswap. Welcome to the podcast, Owen.
Hey, Ben, thanks for having me here.
Yeah, great to have you on. And before we begin, I always like to ask all our speakers who come on board is tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got started in crypto.
Okay, yeah. So for people who might not know, I'm a programmer and I work on a few different applications in the Ethereum space. So I first got involved around like DeFi summer in 2020, when there were a bunch of food farms and I was participating. And then I also wanted to, build something. And at the time, NFTs were much more low key, like Rarible had just come out. So I built something that sort of spun out and that ended up becoming like the 0x Months NFT project. And then with like the community of collectors there kind of grew and ended up building like lots of different applications. The one that is probably like much more pertinent today is Sudoswap.
Awesome. So, what is Sudoswap?
So, up until a while ago, the way that people usually used Sudoswap was for peer-to-peer OTC. So it was an application built on top of the 0x protocol that allowed people to swap anything for anything. Someone might say, oh, I have like these 2 tokens and this NFT. You have this NFT that I want. Let's do this trade if both of us sign and agree. And that's still up today. So people can still do the OTC, but there's also now this completely separate protocol that's an AMM protocol that's a decentralized NFT exchange. So people can go on there to, buy or sell NFTs. And the protocol is meant to, facilitate this in a way that provides some features that aren't present in other marketplaces.
Yeah. So, could you help break it down for, for our more normie viewers, I guess, who are not so degen? I guess the first question that comes to mind is, why would I buy an NFT on Sudoswap and not on Opensea?
Yeah, so the idea for buyers is to ideally have something that behaves very similarly to a marketplace that you see on OpenSea, right? You can see all the items for sale. You can pick the ones that you like, purchase them, or you can sell them in exchange for ETH. So, if you've been on the Sudoswap site and you click around, the interface sort of, borrows a lot from like Gem, Genie, and other marketplaces where you add the items you want to your shopping cart, and then you do the checkout. The difference is what's happening behind the scenes. On a platform like Opensea or Luxer, users are signing these orders, these intents to buy and sell, which then get stored, on like the platform servers, and then you get matched with the orders that you want. What happens on Sudoswap is all of the actual buy and sell orders are represented on the Ethereum blockchain as these pools. So, if you've played with Uniswap, there's this idea of like a liquidity pool. And Sudo draws very similar parallels where people are creating these on-chain listings. So, this does mean that there's like more gas involved. People want to list their assets, but the protocol does a lot to make that cheap. And bulk listings are oftentimes going to be more efficient. And when you, as the buyer, try to buy or sell your NFTs, you'll find that the gas is very competitive, even with like the most optimized exchanges like Seaport.
Yeah, I mean, I can attest to that myself, as I'm an avid user. It's really efficient, really cheap for anyone who is interested. So, okay, the big question is, Sudoswap has actually been talked a place, on crypto Twitter for a bunch of different things. And one of the main things is it has grown really popular over the past few weeks, ever since its launch. Are there any interesting or exciting statistics that you can share about the protocol itself?
So the protocol has been something that's been worked on for over a year now. Like around a year ago, I put out this PDF that was just a white paper that went over the original idea. And then it was later on the year that we started working on the smart contracts. And then it like gradually got rolled out. So it was open to the public fully in July. And I think that first month, not a lot of people were playing around. And then there was like a big uptick in usage starting in August. And then there were all sorts of really interesting, like community-driven pools, like pools that were launching natively on Sudo. And I think it was really exciting to see like a lot of this, type of innovation being built on top, which is really cool, right? That's like why the smart contracts are there, because people can then interact with them. So I think in terms of stats, it's like a few, like maybe 600 ETH of volume every day across, like buys and sells. And, after, originally it was like 10 ETH a day, and then it spiked a lot, and it's sort of like plateauing around like a few hundred right now.
Yeah, I mean, that's really impressive, right? And I guess the big question is, why do you think it's become so popular suddenly, right? Because there's always this incumbent marketplaces like OpenSea, etc., who are kings, and no one's really moved the needle, even Lux, right? But this small uptick, on NFT AM came in, and there's been some stats showing that they've also been taking some of the market share. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, so I think that, like obviously the big reason that you can't escape, which I also think, we're definitely going to talk about throughout the podcast, is like there's the question of royalties or creator fees or, platform fees that are being taken. And Sudo as a platform, is like very minimal, and that there's like 0.5% being taken. And that's collected by the protocol, and that's it. So I imagine, like a big part of it might be that certain traders are very like price sensitive, and they might, gravitate there. But the part of me that's a bit more hopeful is that there's other things about the platform that can make it attractive. Even if projects are deciding to have most of their volume happen on other marketplaces, or even if they have other opinions on like how marketplaces should work. And I think seeing those interactions is also really cool. And I think there's more on the analytics side we can do to dive into like where the usage is coming from. But a lot of the collections that are seeing high volume are ones that oftentimes are somewhat homogenous, which is a good fit for collection offers, right? Because that way you don't really mind which item you buy, as well as projects like base schools who come from like a very DeFi native backgrounds. These are people who might be more comfortable, with like the concentrated liquidity that Sudo uses, what it means to like provide liquidity, or like trading on an AMM might feel more natural for them.
Yeah, you mentioned a lot about how Sudoswap is more attractive to CT natives as well as degens, and I guess that's a big shift in the conversation, because for the most part, NFTs have always been a separate world, right? They use crypto technology, but for the most part, everyone has kind of always acknowledged that, yeah, there's an NFT Twitter and there's a crypto Twitter. There's an NFT side, crypto side. So, Sudoswap is really forcing the conversation, kind of bridging the gap between NFTs and DeFi and making communities clash. And, obviously you're from the crypto side, from the more degen side. So what are your thoughts on this whole royalties debate, right? As the founder of Sudoswap.
Yeah, I think that it's not something that I'm going to be able to give an answer that, everyone is going to be satisfied with. I think that, one is that I've think I've participated on both sides where, I got my start, issuing these NFT collections. I've collaborated with Figure on Salt, which ended up being a well-celebrated piece that was more art focused. I think, the thinking around Sudoswap, right, was sort of an extension of other, really groundbreaking work like what Neolastics did or what NFTX did, where, the idea is that liquidity can be attractive for certain NFT collections. And, I guess it's kind of a default response, but the idea is, Sudo is far from the only game in town. There are many other marketplaces, like Foundation and Super Rare, and specifically for creator fees, right? I think they're going to provide better gallery, auction, and collector support. So, I think that it's pretty fair to say that, for these low edition collections, right? Sudo doesn't even have a good way to sort by the different art blocks right now because they're all under one contract. So I think, there are going to be better venues to trade, certain types of digital art that, I think appeal more to both collectors and artists. Whereas, if you look at again, the collections that are trading the most on Sudo, right? These are oftentimes, collections that are either more DeFi native. So the projects themselves have an inclination to set up liquidity pools, or, they're PFPs where the team has, often raised 7 figures or more in primary sales. And in that case, I think if the goal is to make something liquid, collecting a 3 to 5% tax is a, less defensible position. And, as the platform is built today, that's sort of, what it's facilitating for those types of trades. But again, the platform itself is very agnostic, right? There's lots of room for people to build things on top if they want to take additional fees. And there's already been some, really cool community efforts where people want to trade with certain pseudo pools, but send creator fees or build on a separate router, like what Vasa and some other people are doing. There's lots of ways to build on top of the protocol that can enable this. It's just not a decision that's being made directly on the pool level itself.
Yeah. It's like you mentioned, it's like Uniswap, right? It's just the base protocol. Anyone can do anything what they want after it. The financial Legos, essentially.
And I think there's, a broader question, which is still something that's really early. And that's the question of, how these types of liquidity pools can be additive in terms of volume. I think one thing that we saw when, liquidity pools are early on Sudoswap when a collection launches is you oftentimes get arbitrage between these, between Opensea and Sudo or vice versa. And right, as long as there are other marketplaces that are also taking creator fees, right? The flows one way or the other can be potentially additive. And I know for collection specifically, Bastard Gans have been talking about how, they set up collection offers on Sudo because it's cheapest there. And then people will, maybe buy from other marketplaces to sell to Sudo. So, they can acquire in that sense. But, the trades on the other marketplaces are sort of their focus. And then the creator fees and other things are taken there. So I think, even if Sudo isn't the primary place to trade, the fact that it's, on-chain and composable means that, hopefully there are ways to leverage the tech in ways that can be useful.
So, from what I can tell, right, as an NFT enthusiast myself, I think what Sudoswap really indicates or showcases is that there are a lot more traders in the space for NFTs than there are collectors. And Sudoswap's kind of just addressing the demand for liquidity because collectors aren't going to want to trade. They're just going to buy and hold. That's the whole point of collecting. But I think this, answers a broader question in the space, right? How many of your buyers or holders are actually genuine collectors? And, Sudoswap kind of answers that for everyone.
I think that, yeah, speculation is very hard to disentangle from the crypto industry, right? So many things are 1 or 2 steps away from price. I think there's a separate question too, which also I don't think I have a good answer at that, which is, the degree to which liquidity is either, hampering these pumps or making pumps easier to engineer. I could see cases for both where, if you just issue your NFT in like increments of 1 ETH each time, then, the next price to buy ends up being a lot larger. So that's something that you could imagine setting up. But, similarly, right, you could have like a really thick pool that's, like within the price ranges of 0.1 to 0.2, then people might have the feeling that, there's like a, sell wall in order to get the NFTs to the next price. So I think that, especially for, again, collections where there's like a large liquid, roughly homogeneous floor, I think that there's some preference for having like thicker liquidity there where prices don't move as much. And then, even for like supply size is always the case where, if there's not that many NFTs, then, people are going to naturally space the prices more. So I think that, right, that's like also tied into how the prices move.
Yeah. Ultimately, Sudoswap is, a natural consequence of crypto. At least this is my opinion. If you can arbitrage cost of something out, it will be done. And, Sudoswap might have been the first, but if Sudoswap did not do this, I think someone else would have done it eventually. What are your thoughts on that?
So there were, lots of other platforms that did this in various ways, right? Like the comparison when you talk about liquidity to NFTX is, always going to be there because I think they did a lot for the space as a first mover. And, in the same way, like when you trade using like their like fractionalized tokens, there's no royalty fee being taken on the AMM, or like Niftex, NFT20, or, even something like the previous OTC version of Sudoswap where it's just peer-to-peer. So I think, there's like a lot of different like exchange type protocols which facilitated this. I feel like the attention like specific on Sudoswap is, I think, probably because it, behaves more efficiently like a marketplace than some other protocols where the, like the way of doing exchange feels a lot more like, anyone could come in and fill rather than like you're trading directly with a pool or directly with a peer. I think that, again, it seems like definitely something that's going to lead to market stratification where, I imagine if you're like collectors of, certain types of art pieces, you'd still want to go to like these curated platforms because that's sort of like the sign of quality. And, I would encourage collectors to do that, right? Like there's only so much that the Sudoswap team can build out and, having certain types of like gallery and auction support is going to be much farther down the line. I also think that like an interesting trend is platforms moving more towards helping with primary sales in order to generate revenue. Like I think, Zora recently released some stuff where users can go through like their studio editor if they want to release editions, and, they take like an initial cut of that. And there've been like a few other curated platforms that go that route. So, I think it's definitely like feeding into the thesis that, like the markets are definitely separating into different types, where I imagine, like degens might flock more to Sudoswap because it's like more similar to the type of trading experience they're used to. But, at the same time, there are lots of these like more curated experiences popping up that might cater directly to creators.
You mentioned down the line that there might be some curation auction things. So do you ever see Sudoswap building more features that caters to the creators of NFT projects in the future?
So one of the things that, people like, or that we've been in discussion with are, ways to source liquidity either for aggregators or, for protocols that want to like sort of own the front end for their marketplaces. And again, the idea is that like the protocol, the Sudoswap protocol itself is like very minimal. So, if people want to end up charging like another 1% fee or something else on top, it's like very straightforward to do so. And there have been like some early discussions about, what like more curated platforms could look like using the protocol. So I think, it's a lot of it is work in progress. The most exciting thing is, once the protocol is able to decentralize more, seeing, other people also take the lead and building things on top. And a lot of like the early efforts to experiment already have been really encouraging.
Awesome. Before we end the conversation, there's just kind of one segue that I want to go into, which is over the past few weeks, we kind of have seen the growing prominence of NFT lending and also the consequences of NFT lending. because one of the biggest problems that has happened recently is the devaluation of collateral assets, right? And essentially this leads to a liquidation crisis. We saw that with Pendao, where lenders were at the short end of the stick. Those who were lending their ETH or stablecoins were kind of wrecked because no one wanted to buy valueless JPEGs. Do you see this affecting Sudoswap anyway? Are the inherent mechanisms of Sudoswap affected by the strong devaluation of NFT collaterals?
So I guess there's maybe two ways to tackle this. The first one is, the most obvious role that I see is that for certain collections, where either maybe like the collection itself is putting up LP or there's like a sizable amount of LP that you can be confident is there, right? Lending is much easier because, you have this external pool of liquidity that liquidators can use. So I imagine like the protocol can be helpful in those ways. I think, like a separate related question though is, what happens when there is like a liquidation crisis, or, what happens when like things cascade and, like how wrecked could pseudo LPs be? And, like in what would happen if you were, doing like a normal LP, right? The idea is like, oh, you're worried that someone could dump on you. Or like if you know that someone's dumping, right, you might want to like pull your LP so your position doesn't get impacted. One of the strengths of like the underlying AMM protocol that Sudo uses is users can adjust their price points at any point, or like, adjust how much slippage is incurred. So if you, foresee like some sort of event happening and you want to like capture some of the resulting volume or liquidations, but you don't want your pool to be like adversely potentially drained, there's things that you can do, rather easily. You can, adjust your price to be much lower. Or you could, set like a much higher slippage. So, as people sell into it, they would get like far more like unfavorable rates, which, in this case would be good because then you're not expending as many funds to purchase like the next marginal asset. So I think that, those two are sort of the main thoughts. I guess thirdly is the idea that, I think lending for NFTs is difficult because the markets are inherently illiquid, right? If you only have 10,000 units, there's only so much you can do. So my own personal thoughts are like lending seems to work best when it's like, fixed term, sort of like ruler style, where you're essentially doing like an option. And 0x NGMI did a cool thing with TubbyC, where they're essentially like the underwriter for all of the loans, for these like fixed duration like loans using NFTs as collateral. And I guess, the other way is if you, instead of, having one underwriter, you essentially like ensure that you only like lend out funds if you have someone on like as a counterparty willing to basically like fully collateralize the loan for some duration. In this case, right, instead of doing something like LTV and estimating liquidity or floor price, you just make sure that like, all of the money that you're lending out is being backed by someone else.
Yeah, I love how the conversation has grown. Over the years, we all were like, who will pay for a JPEG, and now it's it's a financial product and everything. It's I'm all for it, but I just like how we have evolved.
Yeah, I think, like philosophically, it's definitely the case that you don't want to be putting a price on everything. And maybe this is why soulbound tokens have become like a bit more interesting recently. But, I think like definitely from the art perspective, there's something that can be unappealing about, always having price for certain assets. But I think, the way that certain projects market themselves definitely, leans towards that direction, right? Where holding an asset could give you access to another asset, or, there's like a focus on liquidity, or in most cases, like volume particularly, which like will tend to financialize them in those directions. And, the way that like, I think DeFi is sort of reaching over, I think, definitely makes that like accelerate more.
Okay, last question for the day. What are Sudoswap's plans for the short term and the long term?
Yeah, so for the short term, there's some really cool tech stuff that is getting added to the protocol. So, some upcoming bonding curves that'll ideally give LPs more choices for, how they want to set their ranges or fees. Some upcoming protocol support for other asset types like 1155s, like various GameFi tokens could also be supported. In the medium term, I think there's a lot more to leverage because the protocol is on chain. So whether this is making it easier for like multi-sigs or DAOs to deploy capital into these on-chain markets, or having like on-chain incentivization, you can imagine something like MasterChef, but for like pseudo pools. I think
Oh,
those are
cool.
really cool extensions of the protocol.
Awesome. I guess that's about it for today, Owen. Thank you so much for coming on. It was great having you here, having talk about everything.
Yeah, and thank you for your time, Ben.
Yeah, thank you so much. Take care.
Take care.